Alcatraz, a stone fortress in the middle of San Francisco's icy bay, where fog hangs like a curtain, waves slam into rock, and the cold water does a better job than any wall ever could. This is where they sent the men no one could hold anywhere else. The most dangerous, the most stubborn, those who didn't recognize rules. Officially, Alcatraz was the perfect prison. And officially, escaping from here was impossible, for anyone, ever. But an official version isn't always the truth. Sometimes it's just the most convenient shape of it. Today, we're telling the story of an escape surrounded by rumors, one that stayed in the shadows for far too long, an escape after which pages vanished from reports, and the right documents ended up in folders stamped "Do not file." A story about men who left the island, and a system that did everything it could to make you believe they drowned. Chapter 1. The Night. The file went missing. They sell Alcatraz like a myth. Cold water, sharp wind, a rock in the bay that turns men into numbers and keeps them that way. The brochures call it escape-proof. The politicians call it proof. The guards call it overtime. In June of '62, the island was running on routine until routine started lying. At 10:47 p.m., Cell Block B went quiet the way it always did. Lights dimmed, footsteps paced their usual routes, the kind of normal you can set a watch to. Except 3 men weren't watching the clock. They had been building a door out of nothing for months. Spoons ground into blades, scrap metal stolen one heartbeat at a time, a plan stitched together in whispers that never lasted long enough to be overheard. The warden believed in concrete and currents. The men believed in patience. The first lie was the beds. Under thin blankets, 3 heads stared at the ceiling, perfectly still, perfectly human from the doorway. Hair, skin tone, the curve of a cheek. Alcatraz had seen every trick in the book, but this one wasn't a trick. It was craft. Papier-mâché and prison paint. Soap shavings. Thread. A barber's stolen clippings pressed into something that passed for life in the half-light. At 11:12, the guard's flashlight swept the row, paused for less than a second, and moved on. No alarm. No shout. Just a beam of light that didn't know it was being fooled. Behind the cells, the real work waited. An artery of vents and maintenance corridors that Alcatraz never showed to tourists. A system of narrow spaces where the walls were close enough to feel like they were breathing. Somewhere inside that maze, the third man, quiet, meticulous, built like a wire, kept the plan in his head like a ledger. Not a diary, not a confession, a schedule. He knew the night rounds down to the minute, knew which guard limped, knew who smoked, knew how long a man could stand under a buzzing light before he shifted his weight and looked away. And he knew the bay. Not from romance, from study. He'd tracked wind direction off the sound of it. He'd marked tide changes by the smell in the air and the way the fog sat on the water. Heavy one night, thin the next. He'd listened to sailors talk in the yard, the way gamblers listen for tells. In the prison laundry, they had collected raincoats, rubberized, ugly, government-issued. Too many for any one man. Not enough to draw suspicion if you stole them slow. They weren't raincoats anymore. They were buoyancy. They were a raft. In a maintenance space above the block, hidden behind pipes and dust, they'd stashed their answer to the bay. A rough, stitched-together float that looked like trash until you understood what it could do. It wasn't elegant. It was possible. Possible is what keeps men alive. Midnight came and went. The island held its breath. San Francisco blinked across the water like a distant promise. Close enough to see, too far to touch. At 12:26 a.m., the plan moved from thought to motion. They slipped through the vent openings one by one. Steel scraped concrete. A sleeve caught and tore. A breath was held too long. A foot found purchase on a ledge that wasn't meant for feet. Every sound felt louder than it was. Every second felt owned by someone else. They reached the roofline, and the air hit them like a slap. Salt, cold, wet. The kind of cold that doesn't warn you. The kind that takes. Somewhere below, the bay churned in the dark. And somewhere else, miles away, behind a desk that smelled like ink and stale coffee, someone picked up a phone and didn't log the call. That part wouldn't make the papers. It wouldn't make the record. But it happened. Because around 12:40, a small change moved through the system. A quiet instruction passed to a coastal unit on the mainland. No sirens. No extra patrol. No curious eyes on the water. Just less attention than usual. It could have been coincidence. In America, coincidence is what they call things they don't want to explain. At 12:58 a.m., 3 shapes disappeared from the island's edge. No gunshots, no screaming, no heroic music, only the soft, ugly sound of rubber meeting water and the bay deciding what it would allow. By 1:20, Alcatraz still thought the men were asleep. By 1:45, the first guard would glance again, swear he saw a face in a bunk, and keep walking. Because that's what you do when you believe in the institution more than your own eyes. By morning, the headlines would say, "Escape attempt, presumed, drowned." But in one internal memo, typed, stamped, and then almost immediately buried, there would be a line that didn't belong. 2 words. Possible survivor. And beneath it, a signature so smudged it looked like an accident. It wasn't an accident. It was the first crack in the myth. And myths don't forgive cracks. They cover them. They bury them. They rewrite them. On the mainland, fog rolled in thick enough to hide a man's entire life. And somewhere in that fog, one of the 3 kept breathing. Not free. Just not dead. Chapter 2. The Bay Doesn't Care. Morning didn't arrive on Alcatraz. It exposed it. At 6:03 a.m., a guard stopped long enough to feel that something was wrong. Not in the dramatic way, no instinctual hero moment. Just a pause, a second look. A beam of light that lingered. The faces in the bunks held their expressions like masks. Too perfect. Too still. He touched one. It rolled. The shout that followed wasn't loud because it was brave. It was loud because it was terrified. Alcatraz wasn't built to fail quietly. Within minutes, the island snapped into motion, boots on concrete, keys clattering like teeth, radios hissing the same phrases in different voices. Counts off. Lock it down. Search the roof. They found the vent openings. They found scraped concrete and tool marks. They found the kind of proof that made every man in uniform feel personally insulted. What they didn't find, what mattered, was a body. By 7:20, boats were moving in the bay, cutting through the fog with blunt authority. The search patterns were textbook. Wide arcs, overlapping grids, eyes trained on anything that didn't belong. But the bay didn't care about textbooks. The water out there is not water. It's a system, a conveyor belt, a cold machine that turns mistakes into statistics and then forgets the math. Around 8:10, a patrol reported debris, rubber, torn seams, something that could have been part of a raft if you already believed there was one. It was logged, bagged, and handed off like a problem passed down a hallway. Somewhere between 9 and 10, the official story began to assemble itself. Not from truth, from usefulness. A drowned escape is clean. It protects the myth. A successful escape is a stain that spreads. The mainland papers were already hungry. The kind of hunger that doesn't want answers, it wants a headline that sells itself. The Bureau knew that. The prison administration knew that. Everyone knew that. So the narrative tightened. Likely drowned. Strong currents. Water temperature. Improvised flotation devices failed. All of it could be true, and still not be the whole truth, because the bay was only half the story. The other half was land. At 11:36 a.m., a call came into a small station south of the city. Not a frantic call, not a confession. A calm voice, clipped and careful, asking a question that sounded like nothing, like a man checking a bus schedule. The desk officer wrote it down, then crossed it out. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was probably a prank, that it would only complicate things. That crossed-out line would become the second crack, thin as hair, easy to ignore unless you were looking for it. By early afternoon, a fisherman in a weathered jacket stood on a dock and told his buddy he'd seen something strange in the fog. A shape near the rocks. A man moving wrong, too slow, like his joints were full of ice. The buddy laughed it off. The bay spits up all kinds of junk, he said. But the fisherman didn't laugh. He'd been on that water long enough to know the difference between driftwood and a survivor. He drove home with the image stuck behind his eyes, a figure hunched over, gripping stone like it was the last honest thing in the world. That night, the fisherman heard a knock. Not police, not reporters. 2 men, dry coats, clean shoes. The kind of clean that doesn't come from careful living. It comes from distance. They didn't show badges. They didn't need to. They asked questions like they already knew the answers. Did you see anyone? Did you help anyone? Did you tell anyone? The fisherman said no. His mouth said no. His hands said something else. Because on his kitchen table sat a cup with a ring of salt at the bottom, and next to it a cheap wool blanket he didn't own. The men saw it. They didn't react. One of them slid an envelope across the table. Thick, heavy. The kind that changes a week, maybe a year. The other man leaned in close enough that the fisherman could smell cigarette smoke that wasn't from his own house. You didn't see anything, the man said. Not angry, not loud, just final. And you won't. When they left, the fisherman stood in his doorway and watched their car disappear without headlights, swallowed by the same fog that had swallowed the bay. He kept the envelope. He burned the blanket. And he never told the story again, out loud. Back on the island, the search continued because it had to. It was theater with real boats and real men. It gave the public the comfort of effort. But behind closed doors, the tone changed. A report came in, unconfirmed, unverified, the kind of report that makes careers nervous. A sighting, a description, a detail that didn't fit drowning. A supervisor read it twice. Then he did something small, almost invisible. He removed one page from the file. Not the whole file, that would be obvious. Just one page. The page with the time on it, the page with the direction, the page that suggested the bay had failed to finish the job. He folded it once, slipped it into a separate folder, and stamped that folder with a label that didn't belong on a prison escape. Do not file. By the end of the week, officials had what they needed. Uncertainty packaged as conclusion. No bodies. No proof. No embarrassment. The men were declared dead in the only way that matters when you run an institution, on paper. The public got the myth back, patched and polished. And somewhere on the mainland, in a room with the curtains drawn, a man lay shaking under a borrowed coat, listening to a radio report describe his own death. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stared at the wall like it might confess something. Because surviving the bay wasn't the victory. The victory would be surviving what came next. And he could already feel it closing in, quiet, organized, and impossible to appeal to, like a prison without walls. Chapter 3. Do not file. The folder wasn't hidden like treasure. It was hidden like shame. You don't lock a secret away forever. You just move it to a place where nobody looks. An aisle that smells like cardboard and slow budget cuts. A shelf that only exists because someone forgot to delete it. I found it in a Federal Records annex outside the city, in a room so cold the air tasted metallic. The kind of cold meant for paper, not people. My badge got me through the first door. A favor got me through the second. Inside the archive was a cemetery of boxes, brown, identical, labeled in the careful handwriting of men who believed order could stop time. I wasn't there for Alcatraz, not officially. I'd been chasing a different story, misfiled transfers, missing logs, the small bureaucratic vanishing acts that happen when power wants a clean record. A retired clerk had called me 2 weeks earlier and said one sentence before hanging up. You ever wonder why they stopped looking so fast? He didn't say who. He didn't say when. He didn't have to. When you cover prisons long enough, you learn the difference between a case that went cold and a case that was put on ice. The annex had a simple rule. Request a box, sign a form, sit under fluorescent lights, and don't get sentimental. I played along, 3 hours of nothing, then 4. And then, like it had been waiting for my hand specifically, I pulled a mislabeled carton from the back of a row. No dramatic music, no dust explosion. Just a tired box with an old inventory sticker and a coded date that didn't match. Inside, routine reports, photocopies, search grid maps, weather summaries, paper that told you the story you already knew, presumed drowned, currents, temperature. Then I saw it. A thin folder, manila, no official header, just a red stamp that didn't belong in that box, stamped hard enough to bruise the paper. Do not file. It's a funny phrase when you think about it. If you don't want it filed, why write it down? Because institutions can't help themselves. They document their sins the way some people keep souvenirs. Proof, not for the public, but for whoever comes after. I opened it carefully, like paper could bite. The first page was a typed memo on letterhead I hadn't seen in years, dated 2 days after the escape. The language was clinical, but the intent leaked through. Unverified mainland contact consistent with escapee profile. Advise, restrict dissemination. Public posture, maintain presumption of drowning. Then a second page, carbon copy, faint, the ink almost gone. A coastal unit log. One line circled in pencil. 0117. Sighting near South Rocks, /subject on hands and knees, /assisted by unknown civilian. Under it, a note in the margin, handwritten, do not pursue. That sentence didn't belong to a prison case. It belonged to something higher up the chain. My mouth went dry in that way it does. When a story stops being interesting and starts being dangerous. I kept reading. There was a transcribed phone call, the kind of transcript that's never supposed to exist. Timestamps, operator's initials, a calm male voice using phrases like he'd rehearsed them. Need confirmation the water search is active. Need assurance no civilian report becomes a statement. Advise closing language. No evidence of survival. No names, but the rhythm of authority was there. Clean, bored, inevitable. And then, at the bottom, an attachment clipped with a rusted staple. A property receipt. Not prison property, not evidence from the island. A list of items confiscated off-site, wet wool coat, salt-stained shoes, size unknown, one crude map fragment, one notebook, water damage. The notebook line had a slash through it and a second note. Transferred / special handling. That was it. No destination. No signature you could call out on camera. Just a bureaucratic shrug that told you everything. Someone took it, someone kept it, and someone didn't want it in the normal flow of records. That's how real cover-ups work. Not with men in dark rooms. With forms. I sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the lights, feeling the weight of that folder like it had its own gravity. The archive clerk looked up once, bored, then went back to her computer. To her, it was just paper. To me, it was a door opening into a room the government had bricked up 60 years ago. I did what journalists do when they don't trust luck. I made copies. Not just photos. Metadata, scans, reference numbers, chain of custody notes. I wrote down shelf codes, box IDs, the names of the staff on duty. I built redundancy like a nervous habit. Because if the folder vanished tomorrow, I needed proof it had existed today. On my way out, a man I hadn't seen before stood near the exit. He wasn't dressed like security. He wasn't dressed like staff. He was dressed like someone who didn't want to be remembered. He didn't stop me. He didn't threaten me. He just spoke softly, like we were discussing the weather. Some stories don't improve with sunlight. I kept walking. Outside, the afternoon felt too bright, too normal. Cars moved. People laughed on sidewalks. Somewhere, a tour boat glided across the bay, carrying tourists past a rock they'd paid to be afraid of. They were buying the myth. I drove back to my office and pinned the copies across a board like a crime scene. Dates, times, the circled log entry, the property receipt. The memo language that tried to drown a man on paper. It was enough to say what the official story never could. Not they escaped. Not they lived. Just this. Someone inside the system believed one man reached the mainland, and someone else decided the country didn't need to know. The next step wasn't writing. Writing was easy. The next step was finding the civilian, the unknown in that coastal log. A fisherman, maybe, a dockhand. Someone old enough now to be either gone or ready to talk because time had finally loosened its grip. I started with public records around that stretch of coast. Old boating permits, harbor payroll lists, newspaper classifieds, anything that could put a name near those rocks in '62. Days turned into nights. Coffee turned into bitterness. Then, in a local obituary archive, I found a small detail that made my hands go still. A man's death notice from the late '90s, a line about never missing a morning on the water. And below it, almost nothing, almost invisible unless you were hunting for ghosts. A mention of an envelope donated to a family Bible, to be opened when the last of us is gone. I called the listed next of kin. A woman answered, cautious, tired. I told her who I was. In Russian, if I'd been talking to you, I'd say, «Я сейчас не давлю. Просто хочу понять, что у них осталось». But to her, in English, I kept it clean and polite. I asked about the envelope. There was a pause long enough to hear the past breathing. Finally, she said, "I've got it." I asked what was inside. Another pause. Then, a note and a photo. My pen hovered over my notebook, like it was waiting for permission. "Can you read the note to me?" I asked. She swallowed. It says, "I helped a man the bay didn't finish. They paid me to forget." I never did. My office went quiet. In the corner, the photocopy of Do Not File stared back at me like a warning label. Because now it wasn't just paper. Now it was a second witness. And if I put it in a video, put it in public, put it where no one could quietly unfile it, then the myth would crack again. Maybe it would shatter. Maybe it would hold. But either way, it wouldn't belong to them anymore. That night, I recorded the first draft of my narration with the folder spread out beside the microphone. And before I hit export, before I sent the story out into the world, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. No caller ID, no name, just the ring. I didn't answer. The voicemail came through anyway. One breath, one sentence, spoken calm and flat like an office memo. "Leave the island alone." Then the line went dead. I listened to it twice. I saved it in 3 places. And I wrote the last line of the script the way the truth always arrives. Late, cold, and unwanted. They didn't prove he lived. They just made sure nobody could prove it. And that was the point.